A very good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ISAS seminar titled Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, Colonial and Neoliberal Origins, Ecological and Collective Alternatives. We are delighted to have with us as guest speaker, Professor Asoka Bandarage, adjunct professor at California Institute for Integral Studies, US. Today's seminar will discuss themes from Professor Bandarage's book, which provides an in-depth analysis of Sri Lanka's ongoing political and economic crisis, taking into account the island's historical evolution with an emphasis on external political and economic intervention. The session will be chaired by Dr. Rajni Gamage, postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. If you have any questions or comments, please post them via the Q&A option. They will be consolidated for the speaker to respond to in the interactive session. I shall now hand over the session to Dr. Gamage.
Thank you, Amita, and thank you, Professor Bandarage, for joining us today. Also, thank you to the audience who has, who is with us right now. This is a webinar by the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS, at the National University of Singapore. And it is 11 a.m. here for us in Singapore, but we understand that it's very late in the night for you, Professor Bandarage. So thank you for accommodating us and our audience at a time that is less convenient for you. So I will say a few words about Professor Bandarage and the book, and a few words about the format of this webinar. Professor Asoka Bandarage has worked on Sri Lanka and on global development for over 40 years. Professor Bandarage has served on the faculties of Brandeis University, Georgetown University, and Mount Holyoke College, where she received tenure. She is currently adjunct professor at the California Institute for Integral Studies. Professor Bandarage is the author of several books: Colonialism in Sri Lanka, The Political Economy of the Canadian Highlands, from 1833 to 1886, Women, Population, and Global Crisis, a Political Economy Analysis, The Separatist Conflict in Sri Lanka, Terrorism, Ethnicity, and Political Economy, and Well-Being, the Middle Path to Environment, Society, and the Economy, and numerous other publications. I will also say a few words in introduction to Professor Bandarage's latest book, which Ramita mentioned just now, titled Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, Colonial and Neoliberal Origins, Ecological and Collective Alternatives. And it was published this year, if I'm correct, by De Gruyter Publishers. I thought I will read a few lines from the foreword of this book, which was written by Dr. Sajid Kamal. I thought the foreword gave an excellent overview of what this book intends to do, goes about doing, and why it is so important at the present conjuncture. So I'm reading in quotes here. To understand the roots of the contemporary Sri Lankan crisis and explore solutions that go beyond IMF debt restructuring, broader systemic analysis are needed. Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, this book, provides that much needed systemic perspective. It focuses on the external determinants of the Sri Lankan crisis and its exemplification of a broader global existential crisis, facing more and more debt-trapped countries, especially in the post-colonial global south. As the book ably illustrates, the crisis in Sri Lanka is not an isolated one, unique to the island, but representative of the global crisis, for alternatives that are just and sustainable. The crisis needs to be understood both historically as well as in the contemporary context, with a fusion of global as well as local and holistic perspectives. And this is what this book sets out to do. With that, the format of this webinar is that Professor Bandarage will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. And for the remainder of the webinar, so for around the next 40 minutes, the audience can type in their questions in the chat box, and I will be taking them and presenting them to Professor. So Professor Bandarage, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you to you, Dr. Rajni Gamage, and to the South Asian Studies Institute at NUS for this invitation. It is indeed a great honor and a pleasure for me to be invited to speak here. And thanks very much for all the participants from various places. I don't know what time zones you are in, but for me, it's about 11 o'clock at night. So let's see how it goes. So why did I write this book? I wrote this book because although the Sri Lankan crisis was getting a lot of international media attention, the perspective on it was extremely limited. And policy making that is based on such limited perspectives, that is very narrow perspectives, can be harmful to long-term crisis resolution and certainly the well-being of people and the environment. So briefly, according to the dominant perspective, the Sri Lankan crisis, which was the economic cum political crisis, surfaced in 2002, was caused by a number of factors, those being the downturns associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ukraine war, and most importantly, mismanagement and corruption on the part of the Rajapaksa regime. The narrative also upholds the struggle, the Aragalaya or the popular movement that led to the ouster of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the IMF bailout as the only solution to the solutions to this crisis. Now, all of these are important factors which cannot be left out, but they only look at the surface of the problem. They don't get to the roots of the crisis, the historical evolution and the global political economic context, as Rajni mentioned at the beginning. My book provides the broader perspective based on extensive data and evidence, and also pointing to solutions that go beyond the IMF bailout. And it seeks to contribute to an understanding not only of Sri Lanka, but other countries facing debt crises, and those are very many. For example, as Debt Justice, the NGO that calls for debt cancellation, has pointed out, there are more than 54 countries, particularly in the global south, that are facing debt crises. And debt is not just a neutral, objective economic phenomenon. It is a political phenomenon and has to be understood as the product of colonialism and the unequal global financial and economic architecture, which is what the book tries to present. In Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, I explore this with an in-depth case study of Sri Lanka, but at the same and showing the unique case of Sri Lanka, but at the same time placing it in the context of global patterns of colonial and neo-colonial evolution, particularly neoliberalism. Obviously, I'm not going to try to cover everything that's in the book, because I want you to get the book and read it. And I'm just sort of giving you a very brief summary and synopsis. So the understanding of the colonial period, particularly the period of the British colonial period, and the introduction of capitalist development is very crucial to understanding the origins of the current crisis. So I explore how under the British, during the course of plantation development, private property rights were introduced and large-scale land appropriation took place. And with plantation development, a number of problems emerged, like deforestation, environmental degradation, as well as displacement of populations and pauperization. And the book explores how Sri Lanka was incorporated into the global capitalist economy as a dependent peripheral economy, and the creation of an export-import economy based on first the export of coffee, and then later it became tea, and also simultaneously dependent on the import of essential commodities like food, fuel, medicine, so on and so forth. And particularly the import of rice became crucial. So not only in Sri Lanka, but around the world, this type of economic system was set up. Previously, self-supporting economies were distorted and turned into exporters of primary products for European manufacturing and importers of basic necessities. So the current economic crisis in Sri Lanka and elsewhere have to be seen, at least the roots of it have to be located in this economic system and the particular manner in which countries in the colonial countries in the global south were incorporated into the global economy. Now, colonial countries gained independence at the end of the Second World War, but as many analysts have pointed out, the economic dependence continued and the hierarchical, the unequal economic and financial architecture of the global economic system continued. In many cases, the terms of trade increasingly disadvantaged the third world countries. Export prices were going down, import prices went up, and the labor and resources from the third world were grossly undervalued. And this is, of course, a continuing phenomenon. And these, with the rising populations, and of course, corruption and mismanagement of local rulers contributed to endemic economic crises, which worsened with dwindling foreign exchange reserves. So this has been an ongoing feature of the global economy. The debt relief and the aid given by the IMF, the World Bank, and other institutions have been merely band-aids, which still keeps these countries tethered to the exploitative financial and economic structure. Sri Lanka, for example, went to the IMF 16 times before this recent bailout in 2023. And the long-term result of this is the drain of resources from the global south to the global north, and it's not the other way around, as commonly assumed. According to calculations published in the Journal of New Political Economy, and I quote from the book, and I have a number of statistics on this, but just one that is particularly pertinent to the debt issue. Between 1980 and 2017, developing countries paid out over 4.2 trillion solely in interest payments, dwarfing the financial aid they received from the developed countries during this period. Now, this is something that is not often known, that it is the global south that is funding the global north and not the other way around. And with the expansion of neoliberal policies around the world, starting in the 1970s, and particularly with financial deregulation, more and more countries fell prey to the debt trap. This happened with financialization and, with financial capital becoming the dominant force in the global economy, sort of controlling every sector of the economy. And the rise of asset management companies, particularly BlackRock, which is a $10 trillion company. And incidentally, BlackRock is also the biggest ISB creditor to Sri Lanka, ISB meaning International Sovereign Bond creditor. And it is also important to note that the ISB creditors are the largest creditors to Sri Lanka, and that some 81% of the current debt is owed to Western creditors. The ISB creditors and other multilateral and bilateral creditors, rather than to China, as is commonly assumed. So the IMF bailout also comes with huge costs, the conditionalities which are costs to the country's economic and political independence, as well as security, if you look at the fact that one of the conditions is the privatization of state-owned sectors, including energy and telecommunication sectors. And when these fall into the hands of external sources, it poses a threat to the sovereignty and economic as well as political independence of the country. The IMF solution is obviously a short-term one. It's a short-term fix to maintain the status quo, to keep the same system, the cycle of debt trap and going and borrowing, to maintain that cycle. It does not address the long-term needs of bioregionalism, sustainable development, local autonomy, or the well-being of the ordinary population. A small, vulnerable country like Sri Lanka cannot change this global economic and financial system on its own. And it's obviously regional and global solidarity and regional movements are necessary to change the unequal global system. But it is important to remember that Sri Lanka was a leader in efforts to create a new international economic order in the 1970s, and the non-alignment movement in the 1960s and 1970s, the non-aligned movement, which tried to, where global southern countries tried to stay away from the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and tried to forge independent paths of development on their own, whether it was African socialism, Ujamaa in Tanzania, the middle path in Sri Lanka, import substitution efforts in Latin America, and also various efforts at nationalization of resources and institutions in many global southern countries. Now, in the long term, many of them failed because of, not only because of internal corruption and mismanagement that is often given as the reasons for their failure, but also because of external pressure and external intervention to avert countries from going off on their own individual paths, away from the dominant trajectory. So here it is interesting to note that in Sri Lanka in 1961, the then leftist nationalist government nationalized foreign-owned oil companies like Shell, Caltex, and others without giving compensation. This led to a massive backlash, including the passing of what's called the Hickenlooper Amendment in the US Senate in 1962, which called for stopping aid to Sri Lanka and other similar countries which tried to sort of stay away, to move on their own paths or challenge the dominant economic trajectory. And with that, Sri Lanka lost its creditworthiness and found it very difficult to continue borrowing at a time when foreign exchange reserves were dwindling and the domestic economic crisis was worsening. And that actually led to the leftist nationalist regime losing the 1965 elections. And here I will just quote one relevant observation from a political economist who subsequently wrote about this. He says, the coerciveness of economic sanctions against a dependent, vulnerable country resides in the fact that in an economic downturn can be induced and intensified from the outside with the resulting development of politically explosive relative deprivation. So there are lots of similarities with what has happened during the current crisis and what happened in 1961, which also led to the crisis led to a political crisis and a regime change operation with evidence of some, external intervention. And when people are so downtrodden as they are in Sri Lanka today, where they are so focused on their survival needs, there is little room for resistance, particularly in an increasingly repressive context. But of course, Sri Lanka, like many other countries, has had a history of resistance to external intervention and colonialism. Now, in the context of what is happening today in Sri Lanka, many look to the BRICS as an alternative to the dominance of the West. The US dominated world order is giving way to a multipolar world with the rise of new powers and new regional institutions and financial arrangements. And many see that as a positive development. But I think at the same time, we need to question if the BRICS alternative, if that is in fact a real alternative, really is a genuine alternative to the market and technology-driven economic system. Are they providing a new model of partnership, a new model of ecological and collective development, or continuing on the same model that is based on domination, profit, and power? And we need to question this, particularly with regard to Sri Lanka and the role of, say, China and India. For example, the port city that is Chinese funded has raised a lot of environmental concerns. And there's been a lot of resistance on the part of environmental groups on some of the developments associated with the port city. Similarly, with regard to Indian expansion, the expansion of Adani Group into Sri Lanka to build a wind power project in the Mannar region, has also raised a lot of questions, because that project has been is very controversial in the manner in which it was handed to India, and two, it was handed without prior environmental assessment being done in what is a very sensitive ecosystem. So I think that these need to be borne in mind without sort of simply saying that BRICS is the alternative. There are, in fact, networks, movements, scholars, activists thinking and about really genuinely alternative thinking on ecology and social justice and the need for transformation of consciousness and actually psychosocial transformation. They have to go hand in hand, because in order to change the current situation, we have to question the underlying values of domination, of profit, of power, and juxtapose that with the need for the values of partnership based on the reality of interdependence, both of interdependence between human and nature and among human communities. And I think that one of the problems with the dominant perspective is that it doesn't give enough room for this discourse to develop. It's sort of been marginalized. When at a time when the environment is collapsing around the world, when the very biodiversity is being lost, and in the very future of humanity itself is at stake, we need to bring these to the center of the discourse, whether we are talking about an economic or debt crisis, because these are not separate, fragmented things. These are all part of a certain global worldview, which needs to be questioned. The whole industrial revolution, the scientific revolution, and the values need to be questioned. So this is a very opportune time for the world to provide a more integrated, broader perspective on what are seen as isolated crises. So the Sri Lankan crisis is not just a Sri Lankan crisis. Obviously, it is part of the global crisis, and we need global approaches, regional approaches, in addition to national and local approaches and solutions in addressing this crisis. So I think I've spoken for about half an hour now. I can stop and take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Professor Bandarage. I thought that was a very insightful and comprehensive overview of what we can expect from your book, but also in general, the kind of thinking that you encourage the readers to follow. In your book, you juxtapose Sri Lanka's political economic crisis with the broad ecological crisis of climate change and sea level rise. And as you explained just now as well, the crisis in Sri Lanka is not limited to the nation state, but has its origins and roots in the global. It is global in its making and it's global in its manifestations. But Sri Lanka is a very good example of that manifestation. So the question that I wanted to ask is, how do you think the present crisis will impact the country's climate disaster-related readiness? And I ask this question also keeping in mind that there are certain concepts such as debt, blue bonds and green bonds that are being proposed in the current context. The idea that certain debt can be cancelled for or traded off for certain sustainable development and environment-friendly initiatives. But there is, of course, it is not as, always as easy or as positive as it sounds. I think that these concepts have to be approached with some degree of critical scrutiny. And so I'm wondering which Sri Lanka's current position, where it is rather weakened in its bargaining capability because of its current crisis. How would Sri Lanka be able to navigate these kind of environmental related challenges?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I mean, I don't address this directly in the book, but I have done some work on, climate change and the political economic dimensions of it. And of course, we have to remember that countries like Sri Lanka have minuscule carbon footprint. Their carbon emissions is very minuscule from countries like Sri Lanka, but oftentimes they are the biggest victims of climate change. If you look at, the climate-related disasters and extreme weather events that are happening, on a regular basis in Sri Lanka, the landslides, the floods, and the sea level rise, of course, it affects 55% of the coastline of Sri Lanka. And it is well known that it is one of the country that is most likely to be affected by climate change in the South Asia region. And it's one of the countries most severely threatened by climate change. So it's a given that it's very important to protect the environment. But in so doing, it is also important to recognize that people are also part of the environment, and the burden should not be put on the most vulnerable groups, which there is a critique that when there are sort of debt for nature swaps, for example, to protect certain forest areas in the global south in return for cancellation or part of the debt, that is one way of protecting the environment. But we should not forget that poverty is also a major issue, that local people also need to use resources. They have to have livelihood. So this is an ongoing debate, like who should bear the cost of climate change, because it's easier for the polluters to buy the right to pollute by passing on the burden of environmental protection to vulnerable populations and vulnerable countries. And as you point out, a debt-trapped country that is very vulnerable, like Sri Lanka, then can be subjected to various kinds of external interventions and demands. But we need to have a holistic approach, because people are really struggling in Sri Lanka. The crisis is not over. A lot of people are leaving the country, especially in the medical sector. In some of the hospitals I've read, there's not a single anesthesiologist. So how are the people going to go through surgeries? You know, the essential drugs are not available. What is available is of very questionable value. So I think that it is important. That's why we cannot talk about environmental protection without social justice. That is why the concept of climate justice is really important, not just climate or environment.
Right. Thank you, Professor Pandaragi. I think that's very interesting in terms of how you said that when we talk about response to climate change, how often the burden of it is unequally shared. And there's this concept of it not just being countries that bear this burden, but also certain groups of businesses and political elite that sometimes benefit from this unequal burden. And this idea of how privatizing profits, but socializing the costs of many of these initiatives. And from there, I wanted to lead you to the second question, which is that you talk about in your book inequality levels, very high inequality levels in Sri Lanka, again, not unique to Sri Lanka, but exacerbated by the pandemic and by the current economic crisis. In the context of these widening disparities in society, how do you anticipate the interests of the majority of the public, the people whom you just referred to just now as undergoing increasingly extreme hardships in their livelihoods? How do you think that these sections of people can agitate or mobilize for their rights in a democratic fashion?
Yeah, I think that's why that discourse, forums like this are important to have a discussion, because these problems are not put forward in the mainstream perspective. You don't hear that very much in the mainstream media or in academia for that matter. So to have open discussions and looking at the many facets of this and how you know, there are differential effects of the crisis on different categories of people. And some people have actually benefited from that. And in my book, I give statistics and figures on, for example, misinvoicing plunder, how people in the business sector, exporters and importers, have misinvoiced their export and import earnings and expenditures and repatriated profits and capital abroad. And if some of that, which is sitting in Swiss banks and so on abroad, were brought back, which is amounts to something like 53 billion, you know, this Sri Lanka would not have had to go to the IMF. And that's also because of financial deregulation, that there were loopholes which allowed some of the business elite to do that. So there is a differential responsibility, not only for the environmental crisis, but for the economic crisis on the part of different categories of people. And much of the blame is put on the politicians, understandably, but oftentimes the politicians and the economic elite also work together. And many of those implicated in the Pandora Papers and so on about illicit transfers of funds are, you know, both part of a political and economic sort of cartel, so to speak. So this is, again, not just a situation peculiar to Sri Lanka. We find that happening all over the world. And that is why I think we have to have open discussions, democratic engagement. And unfortunately, what happened in Sri Lanka in the Aragalaya, or the struggle, the populist movement, which was, you know, started as a genuine effort on the part of people who were extremely frustrated, but there wasn't a broadening of the discourse. It was mostly focused on getting rid of the president and the prime minister, but what transpired was not really a systemic change or an exploration of the roots of the problems and the many facets of the problems. So that is what is needed now, open discussion and understanding of the issues and a much broader framework for both analysis and solutions.
Thank you, Professor Pandaragi. I'll take a question from the audience. I'll encourage other members of the audience to type in their questions. And the question is actually related to what you mentioned towards the end of your comment, which is on the Aragalaya and the protest movement. And it is on what the future trajectory of the sentiments that drove the mass protests, street protests in 2022. What the future trajectory is, what challenges and what factors need to come into play for such a mobilization to be more effective.
Yeah, I think that popular participation discussion are extremely important to maintain democracy, and Sri Lanka has been a democratic country, one of the first countries in Asia to get a universal franchise, and it has a very vibrant democratic tradition and labor movement, so on and so forth, and those need to continue. But I think what happened with the Aragalaya is soon after the ouster of the previous president and prime minister, the discussion kind of stopped. There was not an inner sort of reflection on the limitations of the analysis and what needs to be broadened, the analysis that needs to be broadened. So there is still room for broad coalitions to come together, but the other concern is that there may have been, external interventions that led the Aragalaya in a direction that was not necessarily beneficial to the country's long-term development.
Thank you, Professor. From Mahanama Pereira, we have a question. As Sri Lanka has entered a bailout from the IMF, what hope do you see for an alternative model to emerge?
I wish I could give an easy answer to that question. I think there are movements around the world, like, for example, a movement called Transition, which is shifting away from the fossil fuel based economy to more renewable sources of energy, community-based economic system as an alternative to large-scale agribusiness, and more community participation, democratic participation. And this transition movement, exists in many countries, not only Europe, but abroad. And there are lots of different organizations and networks and communities working towards a more sustainable way of living on the planet in terms of how we use energy, and also changing our lifestyle, like simpler living, which means sort of curbing consumerism, and for example, if you take Bhutan, for example, which is the small Himalayan kingdom, they talk about gross national happiness rather than gross national product, which is symbolically is really important. That what is most important, is it simply profit making and growth for its sake, or survival of the planet and people's happiness? I think we've gotten to a place in human evolution where we have to think about what does it mean to be human, what are our needs as opposed to our wants. So it's sort of a time when the whole dominant economic system needs to be questioned. It is a sort of a fundamentalist system. It's a monolithic system. It's not allowing countries to move on their own paths or experiment with different alternative paths of development. So I think those conversations need to be expanded, and the efforts that different groups of people are making to have more alternative and diverse models of development that are more locally based, bioregional, that are more sustainable, need to be supported.
Thank you. A second question from the audience, and I encourage members of the audience to submit questions in the chat box. What evidence or what grounds do you have for external interventions for the Aragalaya? And if there was, then how much hope do you have for indigenous emancipatory movements with progressive agendas?
Yeah, there is evidence now, and I think since I wrote my book, there's been other publications which are, providing more evidence on external intervention in the Aragalaya, like, for example, some of the IT strategists who were the brains behind the movement, had worked for NGOs which were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, for example, and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a US-based organization. This is connected to the state, has funded hundreds of local groups, that have been in the area of consciousness changing in different ways: youth groups, women's groups, democracy groups, human rights groups, so on and so forth. So there is evidence to show that. And also, the media, the international media played a very big role in promoting the Aragalaya, without also questioning some of the actions of the Aragalaya. Why the attempt to oust the president took that particular form rather than sort of a legal effort to oust him through the legal process. And there was damage to property and people involved. There was some violence, although the movement has been presented as entirely non-violent and democratic in the international media. So I think that there'll be more people writing about this and more evidence coming. It's still an ongoing process.
Thank you. The next question, as part of the current reforms rollout of the present government, the labor law is currently being negotiated or being drafted.
Can you repeat that?
As part of the new current reforms rollout of the current government, a new labor law is being drafted. So what hope do you see for the rights of labor being impacted by these negotiations in the current context?
Yeah, it is. This really needs to be, taken up by internationally, that it is completely, these laws are to the advantage of the employers rather than the employees, and labor rights, are being suppressed, along with consumer rights and so many other rights of average people. And it also then pushes people out of the country to go and work abroad, and not necessarily, under the best of circumstances. So it raises lots of different questions about human rights, labor rights as human rights. And again, NGOs that talk about human rights issues also need to take up these fundamental questions, that we cannot separate human rights, and labor rights as separate.
I'm going to ask the next question, Professor Bandara, again, something that got me really thinking when I read your book in chapter 3, where you mentioned how the present crisis is very similar to the events of 1964 to 65. This is the government of Prime Minister Sirimava Bandaranaike. And during this time, an externally dependent export-import economy, there was worsening terms of trade, foreign exchange shortage, a debt crisis, shortages of fuel, food, very famously certain queues that take place during this time. And as you mentioned, the government does actually ultimately go to the IMF towards the end of its period. And I found this discussion in this part of the book really interesting, because in the context of the Aragalaya and the present crisis, we hear from certain quarters that it was the left-oriented Sirimava Bandaranaike government and some of its protectionist policies that could be emulated to make Sri Lanka more self-sufficient and not vulnerable to some of these problems of capital and deregulation and open markets. So could you maybe elaborate a bit more on this?
Yeah, the efforts at import substitution, nationalization of foreign-owned enterprises, etc., was not something that was peculiar to Sri Lanka. In the 1960s, there was a wave of nationalizations, like, for example, the Suez Canal. There were attempts in the Congo and many other places to nationalize foreign-owned enterprises. import substitution efforts were very extensive, promoted by Raul Prebisch, the Argentinian economist, and was widespread in Latin America and other places. And these were all efforts to sort of move away from the dependent status in the global economy and to move towards a new international economic order. But of course, they were beset with many problems of corruption, mismanagement, and they were experimental. So there were internal problems for their failure, but there was also external interventions, as I mentioned before, like the 1961, when the Sirimavo Bandaranaike government nationalized the petroleum companies and started the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. They did not compensate the foreign companies, that were nationalized, and that led to that Hickenlooper Amendment. So there was a lot of external pressure because with the passing of the Hickenlooper Amendment, Sri Lanka lost its creditworthiness and then found it difficult to borrow in a time of extreme economic crisis and loss of foreign exchange. So that eventually led to its defeat in the election. So it's the political, the economic, the local, the global, all these factors were interrelated even at that time, not just today. But today, I think they are even more closely interrelated because we are living in an even more globalized world than it was in 1960s.
Thank you. Next question is that in India and certain other neighboring states to Sri Lanka, we see the rising role of identity politics and also political centralization that is ongoing. How much do you think these developments will affect Sri Lanka's navigation of the current crisis?
Oh, identity politics has dominated the discourse on Sri Lanka to the point that a discussion of political economy issues, social class inequality, etc., has been marginalized. And while identity politics has its place and its importance, when that becomes the dominant factor and discourse, it takes attention away from all these other issues, including the environment issue, and it divides populations. And as I've discussed in the book, this is the divide and conquer policies, using identity, ethno-religious identities has been a classic strategy of colonialism as well as neocolonialism. So in order to face the crisis, the existential crisis of environmental survival and people's survival, coming together across ethno-religious divides is essential. And even in spite of this universality of the crisis, there hasn't been enough of an effort for people to come together across the divides, although people from all different communities have suffered in the course of the crisis, whether it was the COVID crisis or the downturns associated with the Ukraine war.
Thank you. Next question, in times of crisis, there are many reforms happening in economic, social, and rights dimensions. These changes are more in the form of strengthening governments over people's rights. This is true of India too. So how do you see this trend of increasingly authoritarian governments?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think this is happening all over the world. And it is not just state authoritarianism, it is also corporate dominance. And I think it's very important for us to remember that the world that we live in is dominated by really a handful of corporations and a small minority of billionaires. It's a minority of billionaires who really run the world, and BlackRock, the asset management company, being at the very top of it, and very much a player in the Sri Lankan case as well. So I think we have to see the rise in state authoritarianism and also corporate authoritarianism as moving hand in glove, that they are not necessarily separate. So without really challenging this economic dominance by a handful of megalithic corporations, and especially financial capital, which is at the top of it, because financial capital is driving everything, technology, AI, biotechnology, agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, all of these. And particularly an actor such as BlackRock, I think there's got to be more of a discourse and awareness of that to begin with, because a lot of people are not even aware of this, who the real players are. So there's got to be a awareness, and then a discourse and challenge towards more corporate regulation. There's got to be constraints put on financialization, on finance capital, on ISBs, because countries like Sri Lanka are paying huge interests, and people are not really benefiting from that.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is, Sri Lanka is currently facing drought conditions, and since last year, food security was critical, especially following the organic fertilizer policy that was implemented under the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government. What policies or measures can be taken to make Sri Lanka more food and energy secure?
Yeah, I think this is a global issue. I mean, organic agriculture is good and it's the way to go, but it cannot be done in the way it was done in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lankan farmers had been induced to use chemical fertilizer and pesticides for decades. You know, they were encouraged to do that, and then suddenly they were told to go back to organic agriculture overnight. And you know, that's and this was supposedly to save foreign exchange, but the whole thing backfired. You know, it has to be a much more careful and well-planned effort. And for that also, I think it's important to protect the farmers, their rights, their right to the land. I mean, many places there is a process of land grabbing going on. In Sri Lanka, the expropriation of land has been going on for starting with, of course, the colonial period, which I've looked at very closely. But the World Bank and the corporate sector has been pushing for the Sri Lanka to commoditize land, because still 80% of the land is state-owned. And they want to privatize this land. And if it is privatized, and if the smallholders that are holding state land on lease and they don't have outright private property rights, if that's given to them, it's most likely that they will start selling that land, mostly to external groups, you know, including foreign companies and agribusinesses, and they will be dispossessed. So that's not necessarily going to be the solution. This agribusinesses are producing for export, you know, things like tobacco and so on and so forth. That's not the model, although the dominant perspective, that is what is being pushed, the sort of the techno-utopian, techno-market perspective is pushing for that, but it is displacing people's livelihoods, people's cultures, people's ways of living all over the world.
Thank you, Professor Bandarage. I think we are moving very quickly through the questions, but I just thought I will flag that you're raising really critical issues, especially of land grab, which I think perhaps is not hitting the mainstream discourse as much. A lot of the mainstream discourse is focused to some extent justifiably on the reforms, anti-corruption measures, certain governance-related reforms. But I do agree with you that the focus also needs to be shared at least equally on some of these very critical socioeconomic developments that are happening in the background, especially this issue of land grabs that you mentioned. The next question is, You have also talked about some elements of Buddhist economics in your book. Can you elaborate on them a bit as an alternative?
Yeah, I think the terminology is not what is important. You know, it can be called ecological economics or something else, but it is the values that are important. Because the global economic system that we have, particularly the neoliberal form of capitalism, so unregulated capitalism, you know, with all the deregulation, doesn't put any constraints on growth. It's growth for its sake. And it is built on insatiable wants on the human side. You know, it is constant wants, and the economic engine is going very fast, but in the process, you know, destroying the environment, destroying cultures, destroying people's ways of living. Whereas in the Buddhist economics, it is not about poverty. It is more of a middle path about satisfying needs. It's about social justice. And I have a figure in the book that shows that the middle path is not the extremes, either insatiable wanting or complete poverty and austerity, but a middle path where needs are met and resources are shared so that both the planet and people can survive. So people like E.F. Schumacher, you know, who came up with the term Buddhist economics, have expanded on this more, you know, what it means in terms of the use of technology, the renewable sources of energy. You know, he's talked about small is beautiful. You know, do we need these huge projects? What does it mean to live in harmony with nature? You know, permaculture, you know, new form, you know, it's not anti-technology position. It is also talking about innovation and technology, but technology that is sustainable and not inimical to environment and people, and, you know, also people's health.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is, with elections scheduled for next year, there is a school of thought that the prevailing patron-client system of politics will continue. Do you think the crisis has enabled a fundamental shift in the way in which citizens have rethought how to play their role in ensuring a government that is accountable to their needs?
That's an excellent question. I think that there is great disillusionment on the part of people in all social economic groups, disillusion with politicians and the political system, and an understanding that something alternative is needed, but there doesn't seem to be a leadership to showing the way, or new leaders emerging. It is the same old politicians, you know, who are protecting their own positions and power, so that it is important for more discussion and considerations of ways to change the system. And again, this is not peculiar to Sri Lanka. You find that even in the United States, you know, the great disillusionment with the current political system and the two-party system, and the difficulty for the emergence of third parties and real alternatives to the current system. So I think we need a global discourse on that. And one of the reasons that it is so difficult to come up with alternatives, it's also the control of politicians and the political systems with money by the economic powers that are really at the helm of the world system.
Thank you, Professor. The next question relates to some of these ideas within the protest movement last year, that politics in Sri Lanka should be more inclusive and representative of more youth and women and other minorities. And so the question is, for social movements at the grassroots level that are trying to build contentedness-based industries and living, what advice would you give them in the current context?
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of participation from youth, different communities, women in the Aragalaya, which was a very positive thing. But there wasn't enough questioning of the system. It seemed very surface. So I think that the kinds of things that we are talking about, colonialism and the roots of the crisis in colonialism, neoliberalism, there wasn't discussion of that. And therefore, with the current social media dominance, there's also manipulation of consciousness, and particularly thinking of the young people of all over the world. It's very instantaneous gratification, even with ideas and thinking, rather than a deeper exploration of the roots of issues. So I think that it's very difficult to change that, but I think we need to recognize that social media, which was very much a part of the success of the Aragalaya, as well as similar movements around the world, can also be a detriment to really genuine change and systemic change, because it's just so surface, the understanding that comes from social media.
Thank you, Professor. We have 10 minutes left, so any final questions the audience can send in. The next question is that Sri Lanka was a case study famously cited by Amartya Sen on how a country that is not very economically prosperous managed to deliver so well on its social security fronts, especially in terms of health and pre-education. In the current context, you were just mentioning previously how Sri Lanka is facing a crisis in its health sector, and we know also the problems that are within its education system that it's facing right now. And in this context, we hear discourse that questions the value of welfare as a means of economic redistribution. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a good question, because Sri Lanka, and I have the statistics in my book, in terms of economic growth, was a very weak player, but in terms of PQLI, the Physical Quality of Life Index, I think in the 60s and 70s fared even better than China. It has very high literacy rates, low infant and maternal mortality, and high participation in schools and so on. So it was a very enviable model for the rest of the world. And that was also not because the politicians or the administrations were genuinely caring or benevolent, but it was because it was tied to the democratic politics. It came with the so-called Donamo reforms of 1931, when universal franchise was introduced. It empowered the average population, which did not have the right to vote until then. And so therefore the politicians had to give them something. And what was given was these social welfare benefits, which, led to this high quality of life. But IMF, World Bank model has always been pressuring governments to cut back on social welfare payments as being very expensive and hard to maintain. And for example, the rice ration, when the rice was rationed out to the people, when that was cut, there were riots, and governments were defeated during elections when some of these social benefits were cut. But today it is happening in a large scale, but it is happening in different ways. It is not simply direct cuts, But if you have privatization, if you are privatizing the healthcare system, if you're privatizing the education system, the people with money, the privileged classes are not so hit by that, because they can make use of the privatized, the private healthcare and private education, the schools, the many international schools, universities, or go abroad to study. It hits the poorer classes who do not have access to the money for private education or healthcare. And the private hospital system and education system, which were exemplary, is really weakening, and it is a real loss. So I think it's not just about handouts, but it's also about providing people livelihoods. And that's not available right now in Sri Lanka, because even the garment sector, is shutting down many of its factories. And the biggest thing that is happening is large numbers of people are leaving the country to find work elsewhere. So livelihoods are not available for people. And so if there are livelihoods, if people can make a decent income, they can also pay for some of the services. But most people are not in a position to do that right now. Because even in the healthcare system, a lot of basic medicines are not available for people.
Thank you, Professor. Perhaps this will be the last couple of questions. I'll have to choose from them. In the West, we have been hearing about UBI, Universal Basic Incomes, and Alaska has been practicing some of them. Do you see this as a contradiction of Western policy?
Yeah, I have not really studied that very closely, so I can't make many arguments for or against, but I think that work is important for people, not just for money and material physical survival, but as human beings for creativity and a greater meaning of life as a participant in the society, as a contributor to the society. But what is happening with robots and AI now is that people are being displaced, that it is said that just by 2030, that 30% of the global workforce would be robots. So it is displacing large numbers of people, and people are becoming expendable. And so the basic minimum income could be a way to deal with that issue. Here is your basic minimum income, and that's it. Whereas being human is more than just getting a handout and getting something to eat. It's not just being sort of some kind of a passive, it's a passive existence. It's a very active engagement with life. So I think, as I said, I have not studied the issue very closely, but I would take a much broader perspective on that, of the meaning of livelihoods and meaning of life.
Thank you, Professor. Again, I think that's a very excellent point that resonates a lot on having to reflect on what universal basic incomes mean and whether that is sufficient for what it means to live in a dignified manner. Perhaps this will be one of the last questions, which is, do you see social media in its current form as a challenge in addressing the present global crisis?
Yes, social media in its current form is a major problem. You have to ask who owns the social media. I mean, social media is owned by large corporations which are part of surveillance and part of the same global economic and financial system. And whose interests are they serving? And some of it may be conscious and unconscious, but there is a manipulation of consciousness. And there are no controls on AI and social media. It's again driven by profit and power and control. And that profit, power, and control is not in the hands of the so-called masses. It is in the hands of that small elite. and the corporations, the large corporations. So I think we've got to have a recognition of what some have called surveillance capitalism, for example, that social media is not just this liberating democratic force, and to take a more critical look at it. And it's difficult to speak in the abstract, but in the absence of, very specific movements and alternatives, that's where we have to start, with the questioning and with critical thinking.
Thank you, Professor Bandarage. I think we might have to wrap up the conversation right now. Perhaps I can send you the remaining questions later. But I think that was a very good point to wind down the conversation, because looking forward, certain challenges or even opportunities that we face with technological developments and fundamental rethinking of the ways in which our economic systems and political systems can be shaped to kind of address the challenges that we face going forward. So thank you very much for joining us today, for sharing your very insightful reflections with us at this webinar hosted by ISAS NUS. And thank you also for the audience that joined us today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Rajni, and thanks to all of you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you then, everyone. Have a good day.